Have you ever noticed that you can walk into a room and know, before a single word is spoken, exactly how everyone in it feels? You sense the tension between two people who are pretending to get along. You catch the sadness behind a friend's joke. You feel a stranger's exhaustion seep into your own chest on a crowded train, and somehow, by the time you leave that room, you are carrying weight that was never yours to carry. For most of your life, you probably called this a gift, a sensitivity, maybe even a curse. But there is a deeper, more unsettling truth hiding underneath it, a truth that Carl Jung spent decades circling, a truth that explains not just why you feel everything, but why you have spent your entire life reflecting everyone else's emotions back at them, instead of having a clear, solid emotional life of your own. Because here is the question almost no one asks. If you are so good at sensing what other people feel, why do you struggle so much to know what you feel? Therefore, before this video is over, you are going to understand something that will quietly rearrange the way you see your entire life. The moment when an empath stops being a mirror and starts becoming a person. Picture a woman named Sarah, 34 years old, sitting in her car outside her own house, unable to go inside. Her husband had a difficult day at work, and she already knows before she opens the door that the air inside that house will be heavy with his frustration. She knows she will absorb it, soften it, manage it. She will ask him what's wrong before he even says a word, and within minutes, his bad mood will somehow have become her job to fix. This was not new. Sarah had been doing this her entire life. As a child, she could read her mother's silences like weather patterns. A certain stillness in her mother's shoulders meant a storm was coming, and Sarah would move through the house quietly, performing calmness, performing cheerfulness, doing whatever it took to keep the emotional temperature of the house from rising. Nobody taught her to do this. She simply learned, the way a plant learns to grow toward light, that her survival depended on managing other people's inner weather before it managed her. By the time she became an adult, this skill had become invisible to her the way breathing is invisible. She did not experience it as a strategy. She experienced it as who she was, the good listener, the peacemaker, the one who always knew what to say, the one everyone turned to when their world was falling apart. But here is what Jung discovered, and what almost nobody tells empaths. A mirror does not have a face of its own. It only ever shows you the face in front of it. And because Sarah had spent 34 years perfecting the art of reflecting everyone else's emotional state, she had never developed the muscle required to locate her own. Ask her how her husband felt, and she could answer in exquisite, precise detail. Ask her how she felt, and something strange happened. A blankness, a kind of fog, as if the question had been asked in a language she used to speak but had slowly forgotten. This is not a flaw in character. This is a structural consequence of a particular kind of psychological development, and Jung gave us the exact framework to understand it. Jung observed that every human being develops what he called a persona, a mask, a social face we present to the world to navigate relationships and survive within a community. For most people, the persona is a useful tool, something they put on for work or for strangers and take off when they're alone or with people they trust. But Jung warned of something far more dangerous. What happens when a person becomes so identified with their persona that they forget it was ever a mask at all? For the empath, the persona that forms in childhood is almost always the same, the one who feels for others so that others don't have to feel alone. It is a beautiful, even sacred function. But because therefore the child who plays this role is rewarded with approval, with safety, with a sense of being needed, that mask hardens. It becomes load-bearing. And slowly the child stops asking, "What do I feel?" and starts only ever asking, "What do they feel? And what do they need from me right now?" This is the empath's quiet wound, the one that almost never gets named. Not that you feel too much, but that you were never given permission to feel for yourself. Jung had a term for the part of a person that exists independently of all the roles, masks, and relationships. He called it the self, written with a capital S, distinct from the small, conditioned ego. The self, in Jung's framework, is the totality of who a person actually is beneath every persona they have ever worn. And the entire project of human psychological maturity, what Jung called individuation, is the slow, often painful process of separating from the masks long enough to discover what lies underneath them. But here is the disturbing part. For an empath like Sarah, individuation is harder than for almost anyone else, because therefore her persona is not a costume she puts on for a job interview. It is wired directly into her nervous system. Her body has learned, on a cellular level, to scan a room for danger by scanning other people's emotions first. This is not weakness. This is what trauma researchers would later confirm, and what Jung intuited decades earlier, that a child raised in an emotionally unpredictable environment develops hypervigilance as a survival mechanism, and that hypervigilance, given enough years, calcifies into identity. And once it becomes identity, the mirror forgets it is a mirror. It believes it is the face it reflects. This is where Jung's concept of projection becomes essential, but not in the way most people use the word casually today. Jung observed that human beings are constantly projecting unconscious material outward onto other people, attributing to others the feelings, fears, and desires that actually originate inside themselves. The empath's particular tragedy is a kind of reverse projection. Instead of projecting their inner world outward, they absorb the outer world inward until the boundary between your feelings and my feelings dissolves entirely. Ask yourself something honestly. When was the last time you felt sad, and you knew with total certainty that the sadness belonged only to you, that it wasn't borrowed from your partner's bad day, your mother's disappointment, your friend's anxiety bleeding through the phone line? If you struggled to answer that question, you are not broken. You are simply describing with painful accuracy what Jung would call a poorly differentiated ego boundary, a self that has never fully separated from the emotional field of the people around it. Because, therefore, here is the paradox sitting at the center of every empath's life. The very sensitivity that makes you exceptional at understanding other people is the same mechanism that has kept you a stranger to yourself. Before we go further, if any part of this is landing, if you recognize yourself in Sarah sitting in that car, afraid to walk into her own emotional weather, leave a comment with just one word: mirror. Not because this channel needs the engagement, but because there is something quietly powerful about realizing, in the comment section, that you are not the only person who has spent a lifetime reflecting everyone but themselves. Now, let's go deeper into where this pattern actually comes from, because Jung did not believe psychology could be separated from mythology, and the empath's wound has a mythological shape. Jung spent years studying archetypes, recurring patterns of human experience embedded so deeply in the psyche that they appear across cultures, myths, and centuries, independent of one another. One of the most relevant here is what later Jungians would call the archetype of the wounded healer, the figure who, having suffered greatly themselves, becomes uniquely capable of perceiving and easing the suffering of others. Jung's own real-life professional and personal history brushed against this archetype directly. Sabine Spielrein, a brilliant young woman who came to Jung first as a patient and later became a respected psychoanalyst herself, embodied this pattern with unsettling precision. She arrived in psychological distress, hyper-attuned to the emotional undercurrents of those around her, exquisitely perceptive, and through her relationship with Jung and later Freud, She eventually transformed that very sensitivity into pioneering psychoanalytic theory of her own, work that influenced ideas later folded into the concept of the death instinct. Her life illustrates, in real historical terms, exactly what Jung theorized in the abstract. The empath's perceptiveness is not a malfunction. It is raw material. The question is only ever whether that material gets organized around someone else's life, or finally around your own. This is where Nietzsche becomes unexpectedly relevant, because long before Jung formalized the unconscious, Nietzsche diagnosed something strikingly similar in the human animal. Nietzsche distrusted what he called herd morality, the tendency of people to define themselves entirely in relation to the group, losing the capacity to generate values, feelings, and judgments from within themselves. Nietzsche's entire philosophical project was, in essence, a demand that each person undergo what he called self-overcoming, a deliberate, difficult process of becoming who you actually are beneath who you were trained to be. Because, therefore, the empath who has spent her life mirroring others is, in Nietzschean terms, living almost entirely within the herd's emotional weather, never quite emerging as a distinct value-generating self. And Nietzsche was not gentle about what this costs a person. He believed that a life lived entirely in reaction to others, never in self-authored action, was at its core a kind of quiet self-betrayal. Here is a paradox worth sitting with. The moment an empath stops absorbing everyone else's feelings is the exact moment she finally becomes capable of genuinely helping them. Because a mirror exhausted from reflecting everything has nothing left to offer, while a person standing in their own clear emotional ground can offer real presence instead of borrowed panic. The Stoics, centuries before either Jung or Nietzsche, had already mapped part of this terrain with startling clarity. Epictetus built an entire philosophy around what he called the dichotomy of control, the radical distinction between what is within your power, your own judgments, your own responses, your own inner state, and what is not within your power, which includes, crucially, other people's emotions. The Stoics did not teach indifference to others' suffering. They taught something more precise, that confusing someone else's emotional state with your own responsibility is not compassion. It is a category error, and category errors, left uncorrected, will eventually collapse a person's entire inner architecture. Sarah, sitting in that car, was making exactly this category error. Her husband's bad mood was not a weather system she was required to personally regulate. It was his, entirely his. And the moment she could finally hold that distinction, his feeling, not my assignment, something in her chest for the first time in years had room to breathe. But knowing this intellectually and living it are two very different things. And this is where Taoist philosophy offers something Western frameworks often miss. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often translated as effortless action or action in alignment with one's true nature rather than forced striving, describes a state in which a person responds to the world without needing to control or absorb everything within it. The Taoists also spoke of the uncarved block, a metaphor for a person who has not yet been shaped, cut, and distorted by external expectation, who retains their natural, undivided wholeness. An empath who mirrors everyone is, in a strange way, the opposite of the uncarved block. She has been carved so extensively by other people's needs that her own original shape has nearly disappeared beneath the grooves they left in her. Wu Wei, applied to an empath's life, does not mean stop feeling. It means stop forcing yourself to absorb. It means learning to let other people's emotions move past you the way wind moves past a mountain, felt, acknowledged, even respected, without requiring the mountain to become the wind. This is the precise moment in Sarah's story where everything changed. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, not a dramatic one. Her husband came home in his usual heavy silence, and Sarah, out of decades-deep habit, began the familiar internal scan. What's wrong? What does he need? How do I fix the air in this room? And then, almost involuntarily, a single thought surfaced that she had never once allowed herself to think in 34 years. That's his mood, not mine. It was such a small thought. It barely felt like a revelation in the moment. But because, therefore, she did not move to fix it, did not perform her usual emotional triage, the silence in the house did not dissolve, and astonishingly, nothing collapsed. The world did not end. Her husband eventually spoke when he was ready on his own timeline, processing his own day without her absorbing it first. And Sarah sat with something she barely recognized, stillness that was entirely her own, untouched by anyone else's weather. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a slow accumulation of moments where the false self, the persona built to manage everyone else's emotional climate, quietly loosens its grip, and the true self, long buried beneath decades of mirroring, finally gets a small amount of room to exist. Søren Kierkegaard understood this transition with unsettling precision, though he wrote about it in theological rather than psychological language. Kierkegaard believed that the deepest form of human despair was not sadness, but what he called the despair of not willing to be oneself, a person so thoroughly absorbed into external roles, relationships, and expectations that they never actually became a self at all in the fullest sense of the word. Kierkegaard argued that becoming a true self requires what he called a leap, a moment of decisive, often anxiety-inducing choice to stand as yourself, separate from the comforting fusion with everyone else's expectations. For an empath, that leap looks exactly like what happened to Sarah in her living room, the terrifying, almost unbearable choice to let someone else's emotion exist without rushing to absorb, manage, or dissolve it. Kierkegaard called the feeling that accompanies this leap anxiety, and he insisted that anxiety was not a sign something was wrong. It was the unmistakable sign that a person stood, for the first time, at the threshold of real freedom. Because, therefore, if you have ever felt a strange, disorienting guilt the first time you didn't immediately rush to soothe someone else's pain, you were not failing as an empath. You were standing for one trembling moment on Kierkegaard's threshold, the place where a mirror starts to become a person. Rainer Maria Rilke offers something gentler to hold alongside this difficulty. In his letters to a young poet, Rilke counseled patience with the unresolved and unanswered parts of life, urging a kind of devoted, even loving relationship with the questions themselves rather than a desperate rush toward resolution. For an empath who has spent a lifetime needing to fix every emotional disturbance in a room before she can feel at peace, Rilke's counsel lands as something almost revolutionary. You do not have to resolve everyone's discomfort to be allowed to feel calm yourself. You are permitted to let a question, a tension, an unresolved feeling in someone else simply exist, unanswered, while you remain whole. This is the deeper architecture of what individuation actually requires from someone whose entire identity was built around being needed, a willingness to tolerate the discomfort of not being the emotional manager of every room long enough for a separate, sturdier sense of self to take root. Jung described this final emergence using an image worth sitting with. He distinguished between a person who functions like a reflective surface, entirely dependent on whatever light or shadow happens to fall on it, and a person who functions like a lit lantern, generating their own steady glow from within, regardless of the darkness or brightness of the room around them. A mirror has no light of its own. A lantern does. For 34 years, Sarah had been a mirror, brilliant at it, exhausted by it. And the slow work that followed that one ordinary Tuesday evening was the work of becoming a lantern instead, learning to locate her own feelings before scanning for everyone else's, learning to let her husband's bad mood belong to her husband, learning to sit in a room full of other people's emotional weather without losing her own internal temperature. This does not mean she stopped being an empath. Jung was clear that the gifts of deep sensitivity and intuitive perception are not flaws to be corrected, but capacities to be properly placed within a fully individuated self. The goal was never to feel less. The goal was to finally have a self solid enough to feel from, rather than disappearing into whatever feeling happened to be standing closest. And this is where everything changes for you watching this right now, if any part of Sarah's story has felt uncomfortably familiar. Because therefore, the empath's path to wholeness does not run through becoming colder, harder, or less perceptive. It runs through a far stranger discovery that you can sense someone's pain with total clarity and still simultaneously know with equal clarity that it is not yours to carry. Compassion without fusion, perception without absorption, presence without disappearance. What Jung ultimately concluded after decades spent observing patients trapped in exactly this pattern was that no act of love is more honest, more sustainable, or more genuinely useful to other people than the love offered by someone standing fully in their own selfhood. Because a person who has not lost themselves in you has something real left to give you, while a person who has dissolved into your emotional weather has nothing left but an echo of your own feelings reflected back, dressed up as empathy. What this means for your life, starting today, is smaller and more practical than it might sound. It means the next time you walk into a room thick with someone else's mood, you pause, just for a breath, and ask a question almost no one ever taught you to ask. Is this feeling mine, or am I simply standing too close to someone else's? It means allowing silence to exist without rushing to fill it. It means tolerating the discomfort of being needed and choosing anyway to check in with yourself first. It means understanding that setting that boundary is not abandonment. It is the first act of finally showing up for the one person who has been waiting your entire life for you to notice them, yourself. So here is the question worth carrying with you long after this video ends. If you spent one single day refusing to be anyone's mirror, reflecting nothing, absorbing nothing, simply existing as your own clear, separate lit presence, who exactly would you find standing there when there was finally no one else's face left for you to reflect?